We ascended higher and higher into the sky, watching as the trees below us transformed into distant patches of green. Suddenly, a wave of dizziness washed over me, and it dawned on me that the plane was trembling. I had been on flights before and knew turbulence was normal, but this was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Our control seemed to have vanished completely. The wind was now our sole guide, and the expression on my uncle's face spoke volumes. We were in grave trouble. My cousin sat beside me, and I attempted to conceal my panic, though I felt him sliding closer to me. It was evident that we were descending rapidly. I could sense it. Despite not being a believer, in that desperate moment, I found myself praying to every deity imaginable, pleading for salvation. It felt as though we were hurtling towards the looming mountains ahead of us. I squeezed my eyes shut tightly, and I sensed the plane decelerating as my uncle struggled to regain control. I wondered how long he had been a pilot, but before I could even contemplate an answer, he reassured us, "Don't worry, kids, just a minor turbulence caused by a tailwind. I'll reduce the engine power, and we should be fine." As he spoke, the plane started descending while my uncle was still trying to reassure my cousin and me. It may seem crazy that we weren't screaming or panicking, given the imminent threat of a crash, but in that moment, all I could do was shut my eyes and hope fervently that I wouldn't meet my end. I prayed for a swift end if I were to meet my demise, hoping to avoid suffering. The last memory etched in my mind was the trees drawing closer, and then everything faded into darkness. You see, this ill-fated outing had been my idea. I had pestered my uncle persistently for a week, urging him to take me on a ride in his new small plane. But let me backtrack a bit. My parents, both doctors, were unfortunately on duty throughout the Christmas holidays. Their solution was to send me to the mountains to spend the holiday season with my aunt, uncle, and cousins. I was thrilled because I had a passion for skiing and snowboarding, and there was always the tantalizing prospect of my uncle granting my wish to join him on a flight. Little did I know how ill-fated this idea would turn out to be. My uncle had been hesitant due to the adverse wind conditions, but my persistence eventually wore him down. I couldn't tell you how long I was unconscious, but when I regained consciousness, I had to pinch myself to confirm that I was still among the living. I was convinced that the snow had played a miraculous role in our survival. Remarkably, I could move without any apparent fractures. Casting my gaze towards my uncle and cousin, I noticed they remained motionless. That's when the grim reality hit me. Could I be the sole survivor of this ordeal? I wrestled with my seatbelt, experiencing a searing pain shooting up my side. I must have suffered a serious injury. The pain was unlike anything I had ever felt before, and I couldn't help but let out a cry of despair, followed by inconsolable sobs. "Evan." I called out my cousin's name. No response from Uncle Henry. I reached out and gently shook my cousin. He awoke with a painful scream, his leg trapped under a piece of wreckage, clearly broken. As he regained his bearings, a guttural scream of agony erupted from his throat. Fear gripped me, and tears streamed down my face. It didn't take long for me to understand why Evan was screaming. Uncle Henry's head was bleeding, presumably from an impact during our crash. The sight of the blood was disconcerting, and I felt utterly lost, not knowing how to respond. A sudden realization struck me. If we didn't exit the plane and seek help immediately, his life could be in grave jeopardy. Furthermore, the looming threat of the plane catching fire added to the urgency of the situation. I managed to pry open the door, revealing a narrow space that offered an escape route. Evan attempted to rise from his seat but let out another muffled cry of pain. He needed my assistance. There was no way he could free himself. Despite my petite stature, an inner reservoir of strength emerged when necessity demanded it. I instructed Evan to rely on me for support, alleviating the strain on his broken leg, and then, with all my might, I pulled him out of the aircraft. Handling my uncle proved more challenging. I was hesitant even to touch him, fearing that he might not be alive. I doubted whether I had the fortitude to handle the situation. However, upon detecting a faint pulse, I mustered the courage to unbuckle his seatbelt and guide him out of his seat. He slumped to the floor. With no other option, I had to extract him as well. Once they were both outside in the snow, the extent of my uncle's head injury became alarmingly evident. Blood had soaked the snow around him, yet the overwhelming shock of having made it this far and surviving propelled me into full survival mode. However, we remained dangerously close to the plane. The looming threat of an explosion hung over us, a prospect that would seal our fate. So I took hold of both my uncle's and Evan's hands and tugged them as far away from the plane as possible. I couldn't believe my own eyes. When I finally felt we had reached a safe distance, I sank into the snow, overwhelmed by a torrent of sobs. The pain in my side intensified, and it dawned on me that we had absolutely no means of contacting anyone for help. Our phones and the radio remained within the plane, and even if I could access them, there would be no signal in this remote mountainous wilderness. Stranded in the heart of a mountain range, miles away from home, it was the stuff of nightmares, yet it was our grim reality. I yearned to close my eyes and awaken from this dreadful dream, but the sound of Evan's voice snapped me back to reality. "Stella, you have to radio for help. You're our only hope," he pleaded. I stared at him in disbelief. He wanted me to return to the plane. The very thought terrified me. It could cost me my life. But as I gazed at my injured uncle, I realized that I would do whatever it took to save him, even if it meant putting myself in harm's way. This was all my doing. I approached the plane with caution, feeling utterly clueless about making a radio call. I picked up a device that resembled a large phone and started speaking into it. The sound that came out was garbled, so I waited anxiously, but there was no response. It felt utterly futile, and in my frustration, I hurled the radio at the already shattered window. Why had I been so insistent on flying today? I knew our phones were buried deep in the back of the plane inside my bag, and I had no intention of risking retrieving them. Furthermore, the absence of any signal was glaringly obvious. Evan watched me return to them, clearly disheartened, and he understood that my attempt had failed. I apologized, but he remained silent, his groans of pain punctuating the tense silence. What was my next move? Recollections of our journey flashed through my mind, and then it hit me. Just before our crash, we had flown over a small town. It must be relatively close by. Perhaps I could reach it before nightfall and seek help. It was only then that I became aware of how bitterly cold I had become. Fortunately, I was still dressed in my ski attire, though the plummeting temperatures threatened to leave me frostbitten before sunset. Nevertheless, I was determined to make my way to that town, even if it meant it would be my last act. I shared my plan with Evan, and he dismissed it as crazy, emphasizing that the town was at least 10 miles away. I didn't care. The burden of guilt weighed too heavily on my conscience, and despite the biting cold and my own pain, we desperately needed assistance. With roughly 3 hours of daylight remaining, I knew that if I walked briskly, I could reach the town in time. I bid farewell to Evan and kissed my unconscious uncle, who was breathing softly but still unresponsive. I had to leave before it was too late. Have you ever tried to walk through deep snow? It's a nearly insurmountable challenge. Every step felt like a struggle, with the snow threatening to trap me. But the race against time had begun. My uncle's life depended on reaching the hospital, and I was determined to get there. Time seemed to crawl at an agonizing pace, and eventually I couldn't carry on any longer. The surroundings all began to blur together, and I lost my sense of direction. Was the town behind me or ahead? Collapsing into the snow, I reluctantly admitted to myself that I was genuinely lost. Trembling and shivering, I had a fleeting idea that burying myself in the snow might provide warmth. It was a sign of my delirium and exhaustion. Soon, I drifted into sleep. 10 minutes later, I awoke to a loud whirring noise. I couldn't believe my eyes. A helicopter. I started waving my arms frantically, naively hoping they might spot me. Struggling to stand, my side aching painfully, I managed to take off my bright yellow scarf and waved it overhead. Yet to my dismay, the helicopter continued on its course in the opposite direction. It's futile, I thought as I sat down, burying my head in my hands. The sound of the helicopter persisted, so I glanced up once more. It was drawing nearer. I then realized it had changed course and was heading straight for me. I couldn't believe my eyes. If it weren't for that helicopter, would I have ever woken up? As it turned out, someone in the nearby town had witnessed the plane's crash and promptly alerted the airport. Upon identifying the plane as my uncle's, they dispatched a rescue helicopter in a bid to locate us. though they had little expectation of finding survivors. When they informed me of this and airlifted me onto the helicopter, I was frantic, trying desperately to convey the whereabouts of my uncle and cousin. During the flight, I wept anxiously, feeling that it was too soon to be back in the air. Spotting them didn't take long at all. In fact, they were just beyond the trees. It then struck me that I had been running in circles. They swiftly transported my uncle and cousin to the nearby hospital. Even though my uncle remained unconscious, they managed to rouse him once he was in a hospital bed, administering pain medication. He was deeply disoriented and distressed, evidently suffering from mild brain damage. The doctors assured us that he would recover, as would Evan, whose leg had broken in 3 places. They also discovered that I had 4 broken ribs, explaining the intense pain in my side. To this day, the thought of boarding an airplane fills me with dread. My uncle continues to endure severe headaches and remains bewildered about the events of that day. He wrongly believes it was his fault, while I continue to carry the weight of guilt for everything that transpired. His pilot's license was revoked, a devastating blow to him. Nevertheless, we are alive and able to recount our harrowing tale. Ultimately, that's what truly matters.